Have you ever had a neighbor who seemed off? The kind who never quite fit in, who moved strangely, or who made you question what they were doing late at night? Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. Mystery Find. Have you ever seen light where there shouldn't be any? Yeah, it started on my second night in the new house. I was unpacking boxes late into the evening when I noticed a faint glow coming from under the basement door. At first I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe a reflection from outside. But when I opened the door, the glow vanished. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the darkness of the basement stairs. The air smelled stale, like damp earth and mildew, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Shaking it off, I shut the door and went back to unpacking. But then the next night it happened again. This time I sat and watched the door. The glow wasn't constant. It flickered softly, like a candle flame struggling against the dark. My curiosity won, and I grabbed a flashlight, determined to figure out what was going on. The basement was colder than I expected, the concrete steps rough under my feet. My flashlight's beam bounced off unfinished walls and cobwebbed corners, but there was nothing unusual. No source for the light. I was halfway back up the stairs when I heard it, a low, distant hum, like something electrical, but deeper, vibrating in my chest. I turned back and looked over the room again, scanning every inch with the flashlight. The hum grew louder, and then, faintly, I saw it. The glow was coming from the floor. I knelt down, brushing away dust and debris, and found a small, rusted trapdoor embedded in the concrete. The metal was cold, far colder than it should have been, and as I touched it, the hum stopped abruptly. I should have left it alone. But then I heard the whispering. It wasn't words, exactly, but soft, rhythmic sounds, almost like breathing. I felt something pulling at me, urging me to open the trap door. My fingers slid into the grooves, and with a groan of metal against stone, it lifted. The glow burst forth, brighter than before, flooding the basement with an unnatural, greenish light. Beneath the trapdoor was a tunnel, the walls lined with something slick and glistening. The whispering grew louder, echoing up from the depths. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, too large, too glossy, all blinking in unison, staring up at me from the tunnel's darkness. Before I could react, something shot out, a pale, clawed hand gripping my ankle with impossible strength. I screamed, falling backward, my flashlight skittering across the floor. The hand started pulling, dragging me toward the open trap door. I scrambled, kicking and clawing at the floor, but it was no use. I could feel myself being pulled closer to those eyes, to whatever was waiting below. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The hand let go, retreating back into the dark. The glow faded until the basement was pitch black again. I ran upstairs and locked the door behind me. But now, every night, the glow returns, and the whispers are getting louder. Have you ever wondered what your neighbors are burying in their yards late at night? It was just a normal evening. I was taking out the trash when I saw him again. Mr. Elroy, the guy from 2 doors down, was digging in his backyard. Not just gardening or planting flowers, digging. He did it every night, always after sunset, always in the same spot. I didn't think much of it at first. People have their quirks, right? But then I noticed something strange. The pile of dirt next to him was always fresh, yet there was never anything visible being planted or buried, and the hole never seemed to stay filled for long. But then, last week, I smelled it. The wind shifted while I was grilling dinner, and the most rancid, sour stench wafted over from Elroy's yard. It was like meat left to rot in the sun for days. I looked over the fence, pretending to adjust a wind chime, and saw him hunched over his latest hole, sweating despite the cool evening. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I stayed up, watching him through a gap in my blinds. Around midnight, he wheeled something out of his garage, a large, black trash bag, heavy enough that he struggled to drag it across the grass. The next morning, I worked up the courage to confront him casually. "Big project, huh?" I joked as he collected his mail. He froze for a moment, his eyes locking onto mine, unblinking. Then he grinned. "Just cleaning up some old messes." The way he said it made my stomach turn. But then I saw the news. A local bulletin popped up on my phone, a missing persons alert. The photo showed a young woman with bright eyes and a cheerful smile. My gut sank because I'd seen her before, talking to Elroy on his porch a week ago. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything I'd seen. The digging, the trash bags, the smell. My curiosity turned into dread, but I knew I couldn't just sit and wonder. So I grabbed a flashlight and hopped the fence. Elroy's backyard was silent except for the rustle of leaves. The freshly dug hole was there, just like I'd seen before. My heart pounded as I knelt and started digging with my hands, the dirt cold and loose. But then I heard it. Breathing. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam shaking. Elroy stood behind me, holding a shovel, his face hidden in shadow. "You should have stayed on your side of the fence," he whispered. I ran. I don't even remember how I made it back to my house, but I haven't slept since. Every night now, I hear him digging closer. Have you ever wondered why some people never open their curtains? I moved into my new apartment 3 weeks ago, and everything seemed fine at first. The building was old but charming, with creaky wood floors and high ceilings. The only odd thing was my upstairs neighbor. I've never seen him, not once. His apartment windows are always dark and his curtains are perpetually drawn. But I hear him, at all hours, footsteps pacing back and forth, slow and deliberate. Sometimes he drags something heavy across the floor, the sound reverberating through my ceiling. But then I noticed the smell. It started faint, like something stale left too long, but it grew worse each day. Sweet and sickly, like rotting fruit or worse. I figured it was a dead rat or something, so I called the landlord. That's Mr. Dunn's place," the landlord said, shifting uncomfortably. He's private. I don't like to bother him." I didn't push. I told myself it wasn't my business. But the noises didn't stop. If anything, they got louder. Late one night, as I lay in bed, I heard a thud directly above me. And then another, and another, rhythmic and deliberate. I tried to ignore it, burying my head under the pillow, but then I heard something else. A faded voice. Oh, it wasn't Dunn's voice. This one was soft, fragile, and pleading. "Please, help me." I shot out of bed, adrenaline flooding my veins. I grabbed a broom and banged on the ceiling. The pacing above stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. But then, the dragging sound started again. The next day, I went to the landlord's office and demanded to know what was going on. He looked pale, like he hadn't slept in days. "Don's been here for decades," he muttered. "He doesn't bother anyone, and I don't bother him. Best to leave it alone." But I couldn't. That night, I stood in the hallway outside his door, listening. The smell was unbearable, seeping out through the cracks. I worked up the nerve and knocked. No answer. But then the door creaked open on its own. The apartment was pitch black, the air heavy with decay. "Mr. Dunn?" I called, stepping inside. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I moved toward the attic stairs. The smell was stronger up there, like it was seeping through the floorboards. I climbed, my heart pounding with each step. At the top, the attic door was slightly ajar. Light flickered inside, casting strange shadows. I pushed it open and froze. The room was filled with hanging sheets of cloth, stained and torn. In the center was Dunn, his back to me, hunched over something on the floor. He was whispering, his voice low and frantic. "Dan?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He turned slowly, his face pale and hollow, his eyes wide and unblinking. In his hands was a doll, crudely made of human hair and skin. The doll's head turned toward me, its mouth opened wide, and it let out a blood-curdling scream. Behind me, the attic door slammed shut. Dunn smiled at me, his teeth rotting and sharp. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "Now you'll stay with us, forever." The lights went out. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even when you're sure you're alone? That's how it started. A vague, crawling sensation on the back of my neck whenever I sat on the couch by the window. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. New neighborhood, new house, new everything. I was probably just on edge. But then I noticed her, the neighbor across the street. An older woman, wiry, with stringy gray hair that hung to her shoulders. She never came over, never waved, just stood in her window, staring. Every night, her shadow hovered there behind her sheer curtain. And every night, I told myself it's just her routine. Maybe she's lonely. Until the night I waked. It was a casual, friendly wave, the kind you give when you're trying to be neighborly. She didn't wave back. Instead, she smiled, but not like a normal smile. It was stretched too wide, her lips cracking as if she hadn't smiled in years. I couldn't stop staring at her teeth, jagged, yellowed, too sharp. I drew my blinds after that, trying to forget her, but forgetting wasn't an option. But then the noises began. Late at night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd hear scratching on the walls. At first, I thought it was rats or raccoons, but when I checked outside, there were no marks, no footprints, just silence. My other neighbors seemed normal, busy with their lives, but every time I mentioned the woman across the street, they'd grow quiet and changed the subject. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I stayed up, staring out through a small gap in the blinds, determined to catch her in the act. Around 3 a.m., I saw her leave her house. She wasn't walking, she was crawling. Her limbs bent in ways they shouldn't, her head jerking back and forth like a puppet with tangled strings. She moved toward my house, dragging something behind her. A long bundle wrapped in filthy cloth. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone, dialing 911. But then I looked back and she was gone. No one believed me when I told them. The police found nothing. No footprints, no evidence, just the ramblings of a sleep-deprived new homeowner. But last night I heard a knock at my door. Slow, deliberate. I didn't answer, just peered through the peephole. It was her. She was smiling that awful smile again, only this time she was holding something up for me to see. A photo of me, taken from inside my house. Have you ever met someone whose smile felt wrong? The first time I saw her, she was standing in the elevator, facing the corner. Her long black hair hung limp over her shoulders, and her back was unnaturally straight. I hesitated before stepping inside, but I was late for work and didn't have time to wait for another one. "Good morning," I said, trying to be polite. She didn't turn around, didn't move. Then, just as the doors slid shut, she spoke. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Her voice was too cheerful, too sharp, like a bad imitation of normal conversation. I didn't respond. I stared at the floor numbers ticking by, desperate for my stop to come. That's when she turned her head. Not fully, just enough for me to see her profile. She was smiling, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was stretched too wide, the corners of her mouth pulled back so far I thought her skin might tear. Her teeth were small and perfectly straight, like they'd been carved from porcelain. I practically ran out when the doors opened. But then I started seeing her everywhere. At the coffee shop, sitting 2 tables away, smiling that same unnatural smile. In the hallway outside my apartment, just standing there, her head tilted slightly, her teeth gleaming under the dim light. I tried to tell myself she was just a weird neighbor, maybe someone who didn't know how to act in public. But each time I saw her, the smile seemed to grow wider, more strained, like her face was struggling to contain it. One night I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my door, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft scratching sound. I crept to the peephole, my heart hammering. She was there, standing inches from the door, her face angled toward the peephole. She was smiling even wider now, her teeth almost too big for her mouth, her lips trembling from the strain. "Won't you smile back?" she whispered. I stumbled back, grabbed my phone, and called the building security. By the time they arrived, she was gone. The next morning, I told myself it was just a nightmare. I went to work, trying to act normal, but every time I passed a reflective surface, I felt like something was wrong. It wasn't until I got home and caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror that I saw it. I was smiling. Not just a normal smile. Her smile. My lips stretched impossibly wide, my teeth gleaming unnaturally bright. I tried to scream, but the smile wouldn't let me. Have you ever seen a shadow that didn't belong to anything? I first noticed it on a rainy Tuesday evening. The streetlights outside my apartment were flickering, casting uneven glows across the sidewalk. My neighbor, Mr. Callahan, was walking to his car, but something was off. His shadow wasn't following him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the flickering lamps creating an illusion, but as he opened his car door, the shadow moved, away from him. It stretched unnaturally, sliding along the sidewalk, curling around a lamppost like smoke. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, the shadow was gone. Mr. Callahan drove off, oblivious. But then the noises started. That night, I heard tapping on my window. I live on the third floor. I pulled back the curtain, expecting to see tree branches swaying in the wind. But there was nothing, just the empty street below. The next morning, as I left for work, I noticed something new. A dark smear near my front door, like someone had dragged a hand covered in soot along the wall. It led down the hallway toward Mr. Callahan's apartment. I knocked on his door, pretending to be neighborly. He opened it slightly, peering out with tired, bloodshot eyes. "Hey," I said awkwardly, "did you, notice anything weird last night?" His gaze shifted past me, down the hallway. "No," he muttered. Then he added, almost too quietly to hear, "It doesn't bother me if I don't look." The door shut before I could ask what he meant. That evening, I kept my lights on, trying to drown out my growing unease. Around midnight, I saw it again. The shadow. It was back, stretching along the wall opposite my window. There was nothing outside to cast it. No trees, no people, no movement. It crawled, slowly, like it was searching for something. I backed away, heart hammering, and turned off the lights, hoping to make it go away. When I peeked out again, it was gone. The next day I noticed Mr. Callahan's apartment door was wide open. A rancid smell wafted out, and when I peered inside, the entire place was covered in those same soot-like smears. Furniture was overturned, the walls gouged with deep scratches, and no sign of him. I called the landlord, but by the time anyone came to check, the apartment was spotless, like nothing had happened. But last night as I lay in bed, I saw it again. This time it wasn't outside. It was in my room, on the ceiling, shifting in the faint glow of my bedside lamp. It wasn't shaped like me or anything else I could recognize. It was wrong, jagged, writhing, alive. And then it moved closer. I tried to turn on all the lights, but they wouldn't work. My lamp flickered once, then died, leaving me in total darkness. The shadow crept down the walls, spreading like oil, surrounding me. In the silence, I heard it whisper, "You looked too long. I don't think I'll be able to turn the lights on again. I don't think it will let me." Have you ever seen a door that shouldn't open but somehow does? My neighbor, Mr. Griggs, wasn't exactly the friendly type. He was the kind of guy you'd wave to, but he'd just grunt or ignore you entirely. His backyard was dominated by this old, rotting shed, its paint peeling and roof sagging. The door was always padlocked, and for years, I never saw him go inside. Until last week. I was taking out the trash when I noticed the door to his shed was wide open, swinging lightly in the breeze. Griggs was standing just inside the doorway, his back to me. His shoulders were hunched, his head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something. I froze for a moment, watching, but he slammed the door shut before I could figure out what he was doing. But then, I started hearing the noises. At first, I thought it was raccoons or maybe stray cats. Low growls and scraping sounds that carried over the fence in the dead of night. Then came the crying, soft, faint, like a child calling for help. I convinced myself I was imagining things, but last night the smell hit me. It was sickly sweet, like decaying meat left out in the sun. It drifted through my window, making my stomach churn. I couldn't sleep, so I sat in the dark, staring at the shed, waiting for something to happen. At around 2 a.m., I saw him. Griggs emerged from his house, dragging something heavy behind him, a large, lumpy sack that left a dark trail in the grass. He was muttering to himself, words I couldn't make out, his head jerking in unnatural, twitchy movements. He shoved the sack into the shed and locked the door again. I should have let it go. I should have stayed inside. But then curiosity got the better of me. This morning, while Griggs was out, I grabbed a crowbar and hopped the fence. My heart was racing as I approached the shed, the smell so much worse up close. The lock wasn't as strong as it looked, and with a few hard pulls, it snapped open. The door creaked as I pushed it, revealing the darkness inside. My flashlight barely cut through the shadows, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. Rows of jars, dozens of them, lining shelves from floor to ceiling. Each jar held something different. Bones, teeth, things I couldn't even recognize. But then I saw the sack. It was moving. I stepped closer, trembling as I reached out to touch it. Before I could, the sack split open from the inside and something shot out. Long, pale, and wet, wrapping around my wrist. I screamed, dropping the flashlight. Behind me, I heard the shed door slam shut. Griggs locked me in,